paper came out of my dissertation research, which came around because I wanted to do a variation project that was not on sound, basically. I went into graduate school thinking, wow, sound change is so cool and fun, and that's definitely what I'm going to research. And then as I went on, I started realizing, wait, everybody else is doing sound change, and it kind of lost its appeal for some reason. I still like it, and I'm still interested in it, but I think I kind of wanted to carve out my own niche.
Sure.
So I started kind of wondering what I could examine that was sort of at a higher linguistic level, and maybe incorporated morphosyntax a little bit. And Dave and Vic and I bounced around a lot of ideas, and one we landed on was auxiliary contraction that lots of people had looked at kind of in the theoretical linguistic literature, syntax, morphology people, kind of back in the 70s and 80s, and nobody had really done a big corpus study of. And so that kind of seemed ripe for research, especially because UPenn had a connection with the Linguistic Data Consortium, so we had access to all of these giant spoken corpora. So that's kind of how this came about. So I sat down and started listening to a whole bunch of people saying auxiliaries, basically, and then started to realize that it wasn't really a black and white issue between like contracted and not contracted, which is how many of the people working back in the 70s and 80s with just judgment data had been treating the variable as kind of either an A or B type of thing. And as you probably learned from reading the paper, people kind of do a whole range of different things phonologically where their auxiliaries are concerned. So there's vowel reduction, there's chopping off the initial consonant, there's chopping off the initial consonant and the vowel, and it wasn't clear how all of this fit into the kind of framework or the analyses that people had proposed back when they were just treating it as a two-variant alternation. So that was what this paper grew out of. So there was just, even irrespective of like the social or linguistic conditioning factors on the variation, there was just this kind of question of like, well, what is the variation in the first place? What's varying with what? What is the dependent variable? And so that's kind of what I needed to do first, and that's what that paper is.
Great. And so the angle you took, though, was less like, well, maybe in your thesis you talk more about the sociolinguistic conditioning factors, but in this paper it's very theoretical. So you're looking at the formal framework that gives rise to the quantitative data.
Right, exactly. So that was a kind of cool thing that I ended up being able to do, was say, look, if you actually look at the quantitative patterns, they argue for one particular theoretical analysis. And that's another interest in my research, is not just looking at variation for the sake of variation, but looking at variation for what it tells us about how language might be mentally represented and how particular variables might be represented in grammar. So I was trying to do that as well.
Okay. So maybe just to get started with the paper, then, can you give us just kind of a brief outline of? I'm very fascinated by the analysis, and but there are times because unlike you, I stuck with the sound change route and stayed for that. So dealing with morphosyntax and auxiliaries really isn't anything that I've thought about in any great detail before. Yeah. So there's a lot of exceptions to the type of auxiliaries you can look at and under which context you're looking at them. I know pronouns take different types of contractions and intermediate forms, and full noun phrases take different forms as well. So when I was reading it, I got it, but at the same time, there's still like, oh, what am I forgetting here? So how did you keep it all straight?
In looking back at the paper, I was kind of wondering the same thing myself. And I think it's the kind of thing where it started out simple and it kind of snowballed in some sort of way. I know that I started out just looking at auxiliaries after pronouns. And most pronouns end in vowels, but some of them don't. And that's where it starts to get complicated because of phonotactics and phonology and things. So you get, like, the pronoun it for the auxiliary has to contract onto it, becomes z somehow, and then you just get it's, a nice little formed syllable of English. But say you have the auxiliary will or the auxiliary would, you contract those down to a single consonant, ul or duh, all of a sudden you can't stick them onto the pronoun it in the same way, right? Because a tla cluster or tda cluster is not going to be possible in English. So things start to get a little messier. And so I think I probably started out just by looking at the most simple situation with those vowel final pronouns, and then kind of expanded from there. Okay, with the pronoun it, you can't do that, so what must be happening there instead? And then moved on to noun phrases, where things get even more complicated, because it's not even an issue of phonotactics when you can't get those single consonant contractions. So a subject like Sue, seems like conceivably you should be able to get Sue'll be there at 3 o'clock, or Sue'd been waiting for 5 hours, but people don't actually say that. It doesn't actually happen, and that's not an issue of the phonotactics, because a syllable like Sewell should be just as good as a syllable like school, right? Yeah. But it doesn't happen, so that adds another dimension of complexity. There's something else going on there, and something that I don't really have a good explanation for, and it's something that I think people who know more about morphology and syntax than me might be able to say something about that, but there's something different about pronouns as compared to full noun phrases where that's concerned.
Right.
I know less than you do and want to say something about that anyway, because I'm thinking there's probably some dialects in which those things are okay. I mean, they seem okay for me.
Mm-hmm. Really?
And I went through our corpus to try to find some that would work, and of course it's just not a common enough construction to find anything. But yeah, like Sue'd go or Billy'd gone, for example, are fine for me. It's hard to think of an example with have, because it's hard to come up with a plural NP that ends in a vowel.
Yeah, 3. So like, very few people have climbed Mount Everest, but 3've made it to the top is a vowel.
Yeah.
Or like those, like Latin plurals, like alumni or cacti. But that's about all I can think of.
The one I had was soccer teams, which in England.
Totally.
So like Dundee advanced.
Does that sound okay for you though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like crazy.
I found it interesting that they weren't attested in the talk. What was it called? The speech. The speech. Which corpus board did you get it from again?
Which board, and also the Philadelphia neighborhood corpus that was in development at Penn.
Now, I guess, it's interesting that the two came out really identical.
Mm-hmm.
The Penn corpus, or the Philadelphia corpus and Switchboard. And then at first I was thinking maybe it wasn't in Switchboard because it was strangers talking to strangers and over the phone, so it's, it could be a relatively more formal than a sociolinguistic interview.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe had to do with some level of formality. But I was thinking on the same level, the same thing that Gerard has mentioned, that depending on the dialect, you can get these fully contracted forms joining the pronoun. And so the examples that were given, the next guy, you'll speak. Wait, the guy next to you will speak first. So it's fine too.
Yeah, but what about the guy next to you'll speak first?
Yeah, you'll is fine.
Even when it's embedded like that? The guy next to you'll speak first?
Oh, the guy next to you'll speak first. No.
That's right. So there's something else going on when the pronoun is like part of a bigger noun phrase.
Right.
You can't get contraction in the same way.
Right. And this is all like kind of like surface level questions and stuff, but like in the first example of it will be a while before we get there, I think you, and again this is my own production, but I think you can get like a syllabic L, it'll, without having a vowel before it.
Yes, and that's what I call. Well, okay. Okay. So I haven't been making a distinction between syllabic L and schwa L.
Yeah. Notice that.
Is such a distinction motivated, do you think?
I think so, yeah. Because you can get like fiddle without a schwa between the flap and the L. Fiddle?
But why isn't there a schwa there?
I
heard a schwa. Fiddle? Like, let's see, what's another one? With Slavic nasals, it works on the same level, where you can get the N in a syllabic position without a schwa preceding it.
Right. I guess so. As the coder, I didn't make any distinction between a syllabic L and a schwa plus an L, and I'm not convinced I could hear a difference between them.
In a lot of cases, you can't, but if you look at the acoustics, you can clearly see difference between like a schwa L and a syllabic L.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that would be a cool thing to do next, I think.
So you can get back into sound that way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I have nothing against sound.
So the analysis is pretty cool, though, having these multiple sources of what basically are the same surface form.
Yep.
Do you want to, just so that we're all on the same page, do you want to just provide a very kind of brief summary of what that's all about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
examples too.
Yep. So going back again, like I mentioned, there was this literature in the 70s and 80s that looked at contraction, and what people at that time kind of basically settled on was that contraction is probably allomorphy. There's a variable allomorphy. So every auxiliary that can contract has two possible allomorphs, a short one and a long one. And the short one has less kind of phonological material than the long one. I started with that, and I think that is maintainable. But of course, there's only two things there, and as I showed, there's like at least 3 different phonological forms on the surface that we get with these auxiliaries. So a short allomorph can map pretty simply and straightforwardly, I think, onto that single consonant form, and the long allomorph could map pretty easily onto the full form, but then where does that guy in the middle, that kind of intermediate one, come from? And so I propose that you can actually get it from 2 different ways. So you can take a single consonant form and add a schwa to it. So like a single consonant L can get a schwa and become ol, or you can take a full form and take off its first consonant, and then you can get an intermediate form that way. So for instance, have can become of, or has can become us, with H deletion. And that's actually, H deletion is something that you can find elsewhere in English. So we can say, I was talking to him, or he's talking to himself. We can lop off H's on those function words. So that seems to be kind of an independently attested phenomenon. And so one of my, I guess, my favorite graph, my favorite figure in this paper, I really like figure 7. So on page 34, and this kind of kicked off another research direction for me. One of the variables that I looked at when I was doing this study, and I said earlier that I didn't look a whole lot at linguistic conditioning factors of contraction in this paper, and that's true, but on page 34 I did look at the length of the subject NP that these auxiliaries are attaching to. So these figures don't have any pronoun subject data in them. They're all non-pronoun subjects, and I coded them all for how long the subject was in words. So this is everything ranging from, like, you know, Jerry's a nice guy, to the person living down the street from me who I talked to yesterday is a nice guy, like these kind of crazy long subjects that you can get. And it turns out the longer your subject gets, the less likely you are to contract, but you only see that if you can kind of like appropriately define what contraction is and when you're seeing a contraction and when you're not. So under my hypothesis, it's only those short allomorphs that we don't like to insert after long subjects. So when you can correctly identify where you had one of those short allomorphs, you can see this effect. So for is in the top left corner there, where you only really get 2 forms on the surface, the full one is and the contracted one sa or za, when you oppose them to each other in the graph, like I did there, you get those sas and zas tapering off the longer the subject gets. With has, where you can get 3 forms after noun phrases, so a full one like has or huz, an intermediate one like uz without that H, and the contracted one like sa or za. Once you separate the contracted one, which you read through the paper is the only one that comes from that short allomorph, again it tapers off, so we're seeing a thing where these short allomorphs are just preferred after long subjects. And with will, where at least in this dialect you never get the single consonant forms, you don't get sul and you don't get bilil, you always get it with a schwa, right, like su'ol or billy-ol. that's the one that I propose is the short allomorph. Here, it just gets a schwa in front of it for some kind of mysterious reason. That intermediate form also tapers off as subjects get longer. But then with have, intermediate forms for that auxiliary on the surface come from two different sources underlyingly. So in addition to being a single consonant getting a schwa in front of it, they can also come from that long allomorph getting its H lopped off, from have becoming of due to that schwa deletion. That's not something that should have any effect of subject length going on. That's like a very low-level phonetic-y, surface-y type of process. And indeed, in that lower right-hand corner, you don't see any effect of subject length with those intermediate forms. And that, I propose, is because those aren't of the same source as the intermediate or contracted forms with the other auxiliaries. They're not just from the short allomorph, and it's only the short allomorph that has that length effect on it.
What would happen to would there? Does it matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the thing with would is that people are almost invariant with it. They almost only ever say would. So there was hardly anything to analyze when they actually said ud. By the analysis in here, it should look like will. Those uds should be the short allomorph getting a schwa in front of them. But there was just not a whole lot to study, which was kind of a bummer. I think, was there an issue there where people also don't use would very much? I looked into the frequencies of some of these as well. Because if you go back to, Figure 1 on page 24, would is also really low contracting after pronouns. So this was kind of another surprise when I did this study. After pronouns, there isn't a whole lot to look at because a lot of these auxiliaries contract almost categorically. So we really just never say, it is raining outside, or I will see you at 5 o'clock, right? Those are contracting like 90-something% of the time, except for had and would, which we actually don't contract very much. So if you look at the would bar in both switchboard and the PNC, it's like we only contract about 50-60% of the time with that guy, which is another thing that I can't explain, but we just don't contract would very much. So that, I mean, one thing I was thinking about in my dissertation was whether all of these, contraction of all of these different auxiliaries, we can call it one unified process, or do we have a whole bunch of contraction rules kind of floating around in our heads? And I never answered that. But the way some of these auxiliaries contract really frequently and others of them don't might make you want to think that there are maybe two separate things going on. I'm not sure. It kind of makes you wonder about like why variable processes happen at the rates that they do, to the extent that we can answer that, when there's no evidence of like a change. I guess when there's a change progressing, then you generally know that something, I don't know, something is maybe heading towards some particular endpoint. But contraction seems like a pretty stable variable. I mean, there are contractions in Shakespeare. It's been around for a long time. So in that case, why is there variation at all? I don't know. These are the mysteries that keep me up at night. Why does stable variation exist, you know, and why does variation happen the way it does?
Right, and there's no stigma, prestige to contracting versus the full form, right? So there's...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was definitely taught not to contract in writing, I know, in English classes and things, and I tried to look a little bit at style in my dissertation to see whether there are stylistic effects. I mean, again, for these contractions after pronouns, for most of them, they happen at such a high rate that it just kind of doesn't even sound like English to not contract, you know, it is, or he will, or she has. So I can't imagine that those would diminish in more formal contexts. I used a small corpus that we had at Penn of a woman who was a travel agent who was interviewed through the course of her day in 3 different stylistic contexts. She was interviewed at work, and then she was interviewed having dinner with her family, and she was interviewed playing a bridge game with her friends. So it's a nice way of getting one person in 3 different styles, and I didn't find any stylistic effects. That said, there wasn't a whole lot of data because contractions are one of those morphosyntactic variables that don't come up all that often. And comparing the different corpora to each other as well, so you can think that the PNC, the Philadelphia corpus, which is sociolinguistic interviews, might be a little bit more informal than the kind of artificial switchboard situation where you're just paired up with a stranger over the phone. But again, I never really found any consistent differences between those two either. Yeah, so it seems to be one of those sociolinguistic variables that is not really social at all.
Is there anything like within, I don't know how much you hacked at this during the thesis that's not in, or during your dissertation that's not in here, but like would, for example, the difference between like a modal word and a habitual past word, or
right.
That would be fun to look at that you can think of?
Yeah, yes. I remember starting out trying to code grammatical status of would, and that might have made it in, and there might have been no effect, now that I mention it, at least, because there's, like, imperfect would. Is that, like, every weekend we would go down to the shore, and there's, yeah, like, hypothetical, like, if I had $1 million, I would so-and-so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
the first one here is part of just looking at past temporal reference more broadly, and the only thing that seems to come out is that if you have would versus used to, people set up a whole long string of stuff with used to, and then they use would after that, and then the would reduces more as you go along. But we've never actually contrasted reduced. We've never actually done the math on reduced would versus full would in that context. So maybe we should.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
And
it reminds me of the way is has this famous effect of the following grammatical class. At least people have found this with studies of copula deletion, right? So copula deletion is more frequent when gonna or a progressive verb follows the is.
When it's like, a real auxiliary.
Yeah, right, exactly. As opposed to when it's a copula, right, with a noun phrase or an adjective coming after it.
Copulas in yours or just auxiliaries?
I use both, yeah.
Oh, it is, okay.
They're all in there, yes. I didn't discriminate. Yeah, and so I did look at that in my dissertation and did find what other people have found. Yeah, so you contract more when is functioning as an auxiliary with a verb after it, as opposed to when it's functioning as a copula with a noun phrase or an adjective. And that, I don't know if we have an explanation for that either, right? I can't remember. It's one of them. It's a finding that's been trotted out a lot in African American English research because it was integral to discussions of of the origins of African American English. But I can't remember if anybody ever had an explanation why.
No good ones. Which also suggests you could try looking at British dialects where have can be reduced in its full form too, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah, I would love to do that next. Additionally, because there's that phonetic H deletion going on, and of course British dialects have H deletion in lexical items too, right? So how does that affect things? I don't know. All we're going to do here is come up with more questions.
That's ideal.
Can we talk to you about stats?
Yeah, you can.
All right. Well, this is more of a maybe like a methodological consideration involving rates and statistics. But so when you're talking about having predictions that are equal to across groups. So on page 32, you talk about the we should expect to see intermediate forms of will appearing after it at a comparable rate to contracted forms of will after vowel final personal pronouns. So
Yeah.
how do you define comparable rate? Is it like a statistically non-significant pattern, or is it like a magnitude effect, an order effect?
That's a good question. I just went with statistical non-significance, right?
Okay.
So I think I was assuming here, if you have one short allomorph, and let's just assume there is some pattern of variation that's not going to be conditioned by the subject, or I guess basically that's not going to be conditioned by the preceding consonant. And there is phonologically conditioned allomorphy out there in languages, but it's not common. So I think generally the default assumption is going to be that allomorphy is not paying attention to the preceding consonant. And so if that is really holding up here, we should be able to see, yeah, no significant difference in rates between these two environments. So that's what I did, and what does footnote 18 go to? Does that, yeah, that goes to a chi-square test.
That's the answer right there, and I only read the footnote.
Well, it's an end note, which don't get me started on end notes in language variation and change. They're such a pain. Why is it so hard to just put it at the bottom of the same page?
Right, right.
Yes. So I did little chi-square tests on that sort of thing, and then I also had mixed effects, logistic regression.
Okay, yeah.
Or some of the other major effects.
So that was my next question. So not everybody is used to using logistic regression and mixed effects models. So what can you tell us about those?
Yeah. Okay. So logistic regression is what we use when you have a whole bunch of possible independent variables affecting the variation, and you want to know which of those is playing the major role, which, if any, and it can also be multiple ones. It's useful when you need to tease different factors apart, and they could all be having an effect at the same time. That's why I'm not a statistician. Jeez. I'm out of teaching practice, too. I swear I teach this every year.
No, it's making sense so far.
Great. That's really kind of you. So I think in EndNote 16, I list all the factors that went into the logistic regression. So the sex of the speaker, which pronoun was being used, so was it first person, second person, third person, singular, plural, which auxiliary I was looking at. So those were the major, what we call fixed effects, and then there were also random effects for the speaker who the token happened to come from, and which word came after. So random effects are those that are drawn from a giant pool of possible options. So individuals and word identities are usually good candidates for random effects. So if you've used Arborule, Daniels or Johnson software, that can take into account these random effects. And he has a really good paper on why we should be using them in sociolinguistic analysis, particularly analysis where we have lots of tokens from one particular speaker. Traditional statistical analysis assumes that every token in your data set is independent, but when a whole bunch of your tokens actually come from one person, they're not independent. They're tied together by the fact that they all come from the same speaker. So we need to be using different statistical analysis in cases like that, and that's what mixed effects models have been designed to be able to handle.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Most of us end up working with data like that, those sort of big clumps from individual people, but here you have one corpus, like the switchboard, you've got a shit ton of people with a few tokens from each, and the pen stuff, you've got fewer people and a lot of tokens, and yet it's almost exactly the same. So,
yes. What did you just say? In switchboard, we have a bunch of people with few tokens from each, and in the Philadelphia corpus, we have fewer people with more tokens from each.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
The random effects would be more important in the PNC corpus.
Yes, I think that is true. Yes. I think in using them with the switchboard data was more of a precaution than anything, because with the switchboard data, you end up with like 2 or 3 tokens from each speaker, but because those are only 10-minute conversations, that's about all you're going to get. Yeah, but my understanding, but again, you should consult an actual statistician, is that it hurts you more to not include random effects when you need them than it does to include them when you don't need them.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a precautionary measure.
Right. And so for those tests, was it ARB rule that you used then?
I did it directly in R.
In R, yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Statistician.
What's that?
You are a statistician.
Oh no, that's a very dangerous assumption to make. Then you'll start asking me things I can't answer.
No, that was clear. Honestly, thank you.
Well, thanks. That was the only way to keep up with the Joneses at Penn. I mean.
I know. Yeah. And that's NYUers is trying to keep up with the people at Penn.
What's that?
Just went around and around. We were always trying to keep up with you too. So.
Wow. Well, that's great.
Okay. I think that's yeah. If anyone else has questions.
How did you get access to the switchboard data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they have it at the Linguistic Data Consortium, but they charge you for it. So basically, because Penn owns LDC, they have a deal so that Penn students can get access to it for free. So universities can buy access, basically. They can become members of the LDC and then get a reduced price on all of these things. They also do student scholarships, actually. So if it's the kind of thing that you think would be useful for your research, that would be definitely worth looking into. The thing is that Switchboard, and it has kind of a companion corpus, Fisher, which is actually about 3 times as large, about 10 million words, are really kind of these linguistic gold mines because they're audio data that is also transcribed, and they're huge, and that's actually really hard to find. So if you want to do kind of a sound-based study of a more infrequently occurring variable like this, like anything morphosyntactic, that's the kind of thing that you need. It's a pain, though, that you can't get it for free. So I'm trying to think what would work for somebody who didn't have access to these kind of things. There's the Buckeye corpus, which is from Ohio State, which is 40 sociolinguistic interviews. It's not as big, but it's transcribed and it's audio as well. And there's the British National Corpus, which is British English, but it's also more transcribed audio. So there are things out there. I'm writing a chapter on corpora right now, which is why this is all fresh in my mind. But it does, yeah. Switchboard ticks these kind of magic boxes of being audio, transcribed, and big, and those are rare to come by. Are you guys doing corpus work? Any of you? I mean, you have a Newfoundland corpus, right?
Yeah, and most of the people here have their own corpora now. Totally transcribed them. By not necessarily, I mean definitely not.
That's such a bottleneck, right? It's so easy to get people to talk for hours and hours, but then what do you do with it? And you can do so much with a transcribed corpus. You can write scripts to kind of pick out all the words that you want, and at Penn they're doing this great automatic vowel analysis where, of course, you can just feed in an hour of recording and you get back thousands of vowel measurements, but you can only do that once you've transcribed the damn thing, and that takes like 10 times the actual length of the interview, right? So
I was just at the Canadian CDC, which is sort of the Canadian little N-wave thing last weekend. And the people who had been using Fave were just raving about it. They were just giddy at having 47,000 tokens or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great for people working on vowels.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Anybody have any other questions?
One thing you could ask, the subject length stuff. I've counted subject length there by number of words, but there's so many other ways you can operationalize length, right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's about subject length. Okay.
Yeah, agree.
I think you're arguing that subject length is relevant to the morphological end of it.
Yes, that is what I'm thinking.
But subject length is not a morphological measure, right? Like,
right. It can be, right? I mean, if it's number of words or number of morphemes or something, right?
But not in the sense of, not in a structural sense, because the length relates probably to syntax, not to morphology. So the difference between the really tall guy who'd like to do whatever and the guy who has 14 friends who are really tall and like to do whatever is structural.
Totally.
Yeah.
So this is something I've looked at in other work, is how do you tease apart all the different measures of length? Is what's going on number of syllables, like is it as small as number of syllables or number of phonemes, or I mean as low level as that, or like as high level as number of bracketed like phrases, number of maximal projections in the tree.
It'd be different for different variables.
Yeah, right. It should be, but nobody has really done a good job, I think, of teasing them apart because they're all massively correlated with one another, right? Like the more phrases you get, the more syllables you're going to get. The more words you have, the more syllables you're going to get. So I'm working on a paper right now, actually, with a colleague of mine who's a computer scientist, who we've been using statistical techniques to kind of tease all of these massively collinear measures of length apart. And it actually seems like what's playing the strongest role in all these different possible measures of subject length is number of orthographic words, which is totally weird, because orthographic words aren't really even a linguistic unit. I mean, you could imagine it might be like phonological words or something, but we actually found number of orthographic words playing a stronger role. So that's another unsolved mystery for you.
Another reason to transcribe your corpus.
Yeah, I guess so, or to get somebody else to transcribe it.
Even better.
Do you guys? I mean, are you working on morphosyntactic variables? Any of you?
I was almost entirely on morphosyntactic.
Excellent. What kind of stuff is out there?
Well, in Newfoundland, there's a ton, but present tense S marking.
Right.
Past habituals or imperfects or whatever you want to call them, difference between used to and would, especially. And
Yeah, that's really cool.
Is there? What else is there? Which words can take a progressive? Much. What else have we done? Oh, now I feel lazy. Present perfect versus simple past.
Yeah. Yes.
And presumably past perfects, although they're so infrequent that really come out much.
Right.
Future, you will and gonna.
Oh, cool. Yes, that was something I was thinking about recently. So I didn't look at. People often call them contractions, right? Like could've and coulda, should've, shoulda, and that would be another thing that would be really fun to get into. Because I mean, I like these ones that combine phonology, morphology, and syntax, where you want to listen to the sound, but the phonological variation may have like a morphological source.
Also, the dative alternation, which I know has been done in Switchboard, and that again seems to have to do with weight. So it's clearly a syntactic variable, but phonologically conditioned by how much stuff is in either the recipient or the
Yes.
or whatever. Yeah.
Totally. It's cool how many of those length conditioned variables are like movement phenomena. So like the dative alternation and also particle verb alternations, like I put the cat out versus I put out the cat. that also shows length effects, and also genitives, so like my mother's book versus the book of my mother, I guess. Those get hard because it's hard to define the envelope of variation. Like, for my mother's book, can you really have an alternate, the book of my mother? I don't actually know that I would agree with what I just said.
Yeah, and I think that's what people who work on it have found, is they start off thinking it's variation, but then when you define the categories properly, all the variation disappears and you bummed out.
Right, right. And there's a lot of literature going back to, I mean, early sociolinguistic work about, can we even identify, are there syntactic variables? Is that even possible? Is it possible for two constructions to really mean the same thing in the way that, you know, a and ea are really the same thing? And so that goes back to why I think it's important to kind of keep thinking about like mental representations of these things as we're studying variation. It's not just what's on the surface, but we kind of need to know, are we counting the right things? Are they the same thing in some sort of mental grammar?
You mentioned Guy and Lebov's earlier, or Lebov 69.
Yeah.
And Guy. How does your work fit into the frameworks or the accomplishments that they put forward in those?
Right, right. So let's think back. Lebov, 1969, looked at copulas in African American English, and he looked at copula deletion and copula contraction and found that they both had similar or the same conditions on their occurrence, and ended up wanting to say that they were related somehow in synchronic grammar, basically. So the same sort of thing. So using conditions on variation to argue in favor of some particular mental representation of these phenomena. And Greg Guy's paper looked at TD deletion in different morphological categories of words. So monomorphemes versus irregular paths like slept, and regular paths like walked, and found that there was an exponential relationship between the three different types, whereby you got the most deletion in monomorphemes, and then less in irregular paths, and then less in regular paths. And he pointed out that under certain theories of phonology, that could be naturally derived from the fact that a TD deletion rule would apply multiple times to a monomorpheme in synchronic grammar, less often to the pasts, and that could explain why you got the patterns of variation that you did. So I was trying to give another paper in that sort of vein, not just showing you get variation in this way, but trying to explain why the patterns of variation would be the way they were based on some particular grammatical analysis of the forms in question.
But I'm wondering, like, how many variables can this work with? And what variables will it work with?
Right.
Deletion was a good one, and now you have auxiliary contraction. Those are two good ones. But is it the case that all of our variables that we look at, can they be quantitatively derived on these abstract principles?
Right. One thing I've thought about this for is, well, I mean, you mentioned S marking, and so that could be something. I know in some languages, at least, there can be morphological sources or phonological sources, right? So I know that some of the work on Spanish S deletion has proposed that there could be an S allomorph alternating with a zero allomorph. But there could also be some sort of like phonetic or phonological rule of S deletion, and people have proposed this for TD deletion as well. There could be a zero morpheme, but there could also be, you know, something phonetic that results in us deleting our T's and D's. So if you could get maybe independent evidence on how often either of those processes occur, and then you could use that to tease out when you have one or the other. It's a little bit like what I'm trying to do with the H deletion in this paper. In other of my work, if H deletion is just kind of a low-level phonetic process that can apply to any of our function words with H, then we should be able to see the same rate of H deletion in pronouns like him and her and he and herself that we're seeing in these auxiliaries here. So that is work that I'm doing with Charles Young at the University of Pennsylvania, looking at H deletion and seeing how well the patterns kind of come out. Yeah, but I think it's important that we kind of think about the different grammatical sources of the variants that we see on the surface, and not necessarily think that they're all manifestations of the same thing in synchronic grammar necessarily. But I also just think it's fun to kind of be able to think about why any of this is happening, and to kind of bring sociolinguistics more in line with people who are doing formal linguistic theory, because we can all too often kind of be sort of islands of the people who are working with real data, and there's no reason it needs to be that way. I think we can kind of inform what each other are doing.
With H deletion, you talk about it as a low-level thing that happens, but if it happens to function words and not elsewhere, in a sense, it's not quite so low-level, because the deletion is deciding whether it applies at.
That's true. I think what it only applies to is these function words that have like cliticized to a lexical word before them. So I think you can find it in words like he when they're in a phonological word with what precedes. So something like, but he wasn't there on time, or I know that he was there waiting for me. You can't get it like sentence initially. So he's a good friend of mine, but not he's a good friend of mine, right? So it is only confined to function words, but I think it's confined only to function words in particular prosodic positions. So I think, yeah, more than just the word type, it might be the prosodic representation, or like the prosodic structure of the words that it applies to.
But even the fact it's only found in function words has already separated out, say, North American English, well, most North American English, from some British English or half of Newfoundland English, for example, where you have just generalized H deletion.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I think in American English it's like a connected or a fast speech process, like vowel reduction or something. Whereas I think, yeah, like in British English, it's something bigger, something else going on, because you can get it in those lexical items, and you can get it sentence initially. My hunch would be that in American English it has an effective speech rate, whereas, say, maybe in British English it wouldn't. But that remains to be seen.
Great.
Cool. Well, thanks for checking in, guys.
Okay, see you tomorrow. See you in methods.
Some of you in methods, yep. Bye.
See ya.